For those of you who are just coming in, we'll be waiting for a minute or two while Zoom populates here. So Zoom is continuing to populate here, letting people in one by one. So we'll get started in about a minute or so. All right, why don't we go ahead and get started here? And I can't start I can't seem to turn the record on. So can somebody turn that on?
It's already going.
Okay. So welcome to the CBITs webinar, which we're holding in collaboration with the Society for Digital Mental Health. This is the December webinar, last of this year. This is being recorded. So before I introduce Nick Jacobson here, I just want to mention, please, if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A as during the talk. And as they come up, go ahead and put them in. It's often people wait until 5 minutes before the seminar is over, and then we can't get them all in. So get it in early so that we can answer your question. All right, so I'm really pleased to introduce Nick Jacobson. So he's an assistant professor in the departments of biomedical data science and psychiatry in the Geisel School of Medicine at Dartmouth University. And he's the director of treatment development and the evaluation core in the Center for Technology and Behavioral Health. He does work in precision assessment of anxiety and depression, in assessment using passive sensor data in phones and wearables, and scalable personalized technology-based treatments, which he's going to talk to us about. And I'm really, really pleased because I don't know Nick really well, but I have been a huge fan of his work, and I've learned a lot from him over the years. So I know I'm going to enjoy his talk, and I hope that you all do too. So Nick, I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thank you all for inviting me for this talk, and thank you all in the audience for joining me today. I am really passionate about these topics, and if any questions or want to talk any further, I am very happy to do so. You're all able to see my, like, Zoom is still acting up strangely, at least. So I just want to make sure that you all.
Now we see it.
Okay, great. So I always like to get on the same page for folks who are coming in with different backgrounds. I work with a lot of folks in computer science and with different backgrounds. So I always try to make sure everybody's kind of coming at it with some of what I'll talk about mostly today with the same kind of information. So overall, mental health disorders, which is most of what I study, are very common. The common ones occur in about 1 in 3 people in any given year. These disorders are the leading cause of disability worldwide. They're associated with significant impacts in all-cause mortality, and they are really something that we should care about. Unfortunately, our system, our current traditional care system, is really not really doing well and actually treating most folks. Most folks that have a common mental health disorder do not actually receive minimally adequate treatment. And here, this is a really low bar for what's minimally adequate. This is one mental health care session with any type of provider in a given year. So most folks really aren't receiving any type of treatment. And I view this as a system problem, because if you compare the rates of common mental health disorders to the rate of the number of providers there are in the population, there is about 1,500 patients with just an anxiety or depressive disorder per mental health care provider. And there are some settings that ratio is a little bit lower, and some rate that it's a little bit higher. But just about anywhere that you go, you're not going to have enough providers to the number of patients that would actually need treatment. So overall, this is like astoundingly like off by about an order of magnitude in terms of within the model of the traditional care system being able to address this huge need. And you can view this slide as the glass half full or glass half full slide, or a glass half empty slide. I go to the Association for Behavioral and Cognitive Therapies conference every year, and that association likes to have a slogan. Their Twitter handle used to be CBT works. And it does, if you look at it at the group level, on average, CBT does tend to outperform control groups at the group level. But about 1 in 2 people of these that would be randomized into these gold standard courses of treatment would still meet diagnostic criteria for the disorder at the end of these in-person treatments. So after they've received a full course, half of them immediately after terminating this treatment will still meet diagnostic criteria for the disorder they came in with. So we've got a long way to go, even within our traditional care system, and I view that as in part due to heterogeneity. So this is a preview of what I'm going to talk about. Most of it you'll see talk a lot about using different types of prediction models, and I'll talk about how a lot of this is layered in through technology. So the first thing I'll talk about is multi-method assessment or multimodal assessment. And my work uses passively collected data, primarily through smartphones and wearables. We also do internet behavior and through electronic health records. But this umbrella of things is essentially what I call data that are gathered via technology, that are done can be done passively without active participation by a given individual. So here it would be used through, for example, smartphones and wearables, which can capture data continuously without the user really doing much more than they normally would within their daily lives. So most of you probably have a smartphone in front of you, around you, or in your pocket. And in this, these types of devices can gather information that I think we've been hoping to gather as a field for about 100 years. So behaviorists have been talking about the idea of being able to observe behavior in folks' naturalistic settings longitudinally and be able to do it in an objective manner. And this has been like early behavioral case reports talking about that as what they were longing for as the gold standard. And we can do that really unobtrusively and in multifaceted ways through a number of constructs that we care about that are really linked to psychopathology and mental health. So if we take a construct like social contact, we can capture many different facets of it using just a smartphone. We can capture, we can turn on the microphone and do turn on the microphone to see if we can detect speech of nearby persons. We try to detect how long those conversations that are happening in person are and how many people are talking. We can do that in anonymously preserving ways, so ways that don't actually need to record those conversations. We can turn on the Bluetooth and try to, because most people leave their Bluetooth on and other people have their Bluetooth on as well. When we're around our phones or around other phones, we can actually tell that. So we can essentially tell how many folks are around us with our phones. So that gives us a sense of social proximity, of an in-person proximity to other mobile phones. And this then, so these are in-person means of assessing social contact or social contact that's expressed in person. But we can also use smartphones to assess digital contact. So text and call frequency, use of social media apps and other types of social app channels like WhatsApp. And so it can give us a pretty good sense of what social contact really looks like. And that can be done continuously and embedded longitudinally through folks' daily lives. And that's just one channel, but these kinds of things, these types of behaviors that we can observe are quite rich, quite important to a lot of our mental health outcomes. They can be both these external behaviors, but they can also include a lot of very personal thoughts and feelings that can be expressed through things like search behavior. So I think there's a lot of utility here, and I'm going to be talking about gathering information like this, and then mostly how we can put these data to use to actually enable and enhance assessment and treatment within digital means. So I am a clinical psychologist by training, and a lot of my interests are translational. So not using these things necessarily just to study and do basic science, but when I think about the channels of information that we're gathering, most of what I think about is how can we put these to use? So what is their use case? So one use case for this type of things on the assessment end is trying to predict something that doesn't change or is assumed not to change. Something that's maybe a trait level difference. So a utility here might be trying to detect persons who need treatment, to detect the severity of symptoms, or that someone is already receiving treatment, something along those lines. And we've done a lot of work here. So we've used wearable sensors to try to predict what folks that are currently experiencing a major depressive episode and inpatients and outpatients. And we pair these types of data most predominantly with machine learning models of various forms and architectures. And I'm happy to talk about this if folks have questions, but mostly I'll talk about the applied setting here today. And here, this is one of the models that we worked on, for example, where we use just wearable movement data. And you can see the little blue guys on this slide are models predictions that were correct out of sample. And our little red guys are the model predictions that were incorrect. Overall, you can see that the model is doing pretty well. It's imperfect, but overall it's pretty well distinguishing between folks with major depressive episodes from controls. So this can be used for to detect MDD. Can it also be used for depression severity? Yeah, we've done that as well using also wearable movement data and shown that we can very strongly differentiate the range of depression severity among folks that are experiencing a moderate symptom severity to very extreme symptom severity. We've done this in other areas that are thought to be very internal experiences and very subjective experiences. So one of the areas that we've applied this to is to try to detect pain in persons living with HIV. And when you actually, a gold assessment standard of pain is something that is very subjective, something that you would go through and on behalf of the doctor's office. And the gold standard measure is something that is from rated, say, on a 0 to 10 scale with little anchors along the way. And so because of this, you may think because pain has this subjective component that we wouldn't be able to predict it. But again, through wearable movement data, we can predict about half of the variation and pain severity across persons through these wearable means. So these wearable movement data, and these are all, again, out of sample prediction. So the models were not trained. These models are being evaluated on points that they weren't being used to train on. So here again, we can do this with social anxiety symptom severity. This, instead of wearable movement data, we're using smartphone sensor data. Here, using calls, text, and movement. And we have a lot of reason to think about a lot of these social markers that would be gathered related to social contacts, that they could actually index things like behavioral avoidance patterns related to social anxiety, things like not picking up calls, having delays between when someone would text us and when someone would text back. And so we went in this kind of thinking that this was probably promising, and we found that there was, again, a large signal here where we could predict about half of the variation in social anxiety symptom severity. We can do this in other disorders that are also marked by avoidance. So PTSD, for example, here we use just GPS data from gathered via smartphones across 2 weeks. And we wanted to see if we could differentiate folks with post-traumatic stress disorder from trauma-exposed controls. So everyone in this study had been exposed to childhood trauma, and about a portion of the sample was diagnostic and a portion that were not. And so we had about 185 folks that we were using the data from here. And we could pretty well differentiate folks that had PTSD from those who didn't. And again, this was a fairly challenging setting in which it's not just a non-disordered control. These were all folks that were exposed to trauma. We can do this in trying to predict something that would maybe be also a marker of something that we would want to act on imminently. So here in this study, we were trying to use Instagram data to try to predict whether folks are experiencing just passive suicidal ideation or whether they are experiencing active suicidal ideation. And so there were various markers that were included through language patterns and also just behavioral data that were on the Instagram platform. And we could, again, do well better than chance in trying to differentiate active from passive ideation. We've done this in generalized anxiety disorder, where we were trying to predict folks who were at elevated risk for generalized anxiety disorder. And you can see that we really had quite high sensitivity and specificity with these models. When we look at our risk scores and see what they're actually related to, you can see that our models correlations essentially with different facets of GAD on the right. And our models, as I would have expected, this is wearable movement data, I would have expected restlessness to be one of the big things to pop out, and it does. Because one of the things that we can use with wearable movement data is psychomotor agitation, or the little fidgeting that often happens in anxiety. And we can see that. We can see that it's pretty strongly related to restlessness, but it's also related to other things that I may not have expected. Things like irritability, the difficulty controlling one's worries, and feeling as if one is going out of their mind. So these models can be used in ways that could also expand the idea of maybe we are actually able to tap into all of these internal experiences, and we may be able to do fine-tuned assessments to try to disentangle this. We've also used these kinds of models without giving them a label. So in this paper, we just showed these models wearable movement data. We didn't tell them who it's from. We didn't tell them what to predict. We just said, hey, just try to differentiate the main components of these wearable movement data patterns, and try to at the greatest distance among similarities and try to group similar people. One of the things that we're finding with this in these unsupervised machine learning techniques is that the models themselves can actually well differentiate folks with major depression from folks with schizophrenia and controls. Schizophrenia and controls could also be somewhat differentiated from one another, but a little bit less easily. So these models seem to be capable of picking up on signal that is kind of inherent in the wearable movement data, even without labels, which is kind of remarkable. We've also done this to try to predict whether folks are currently receiving an SSRI, a common class of antidepressants, And we've again used wearable movement data to try to see if we can predict folks that are using SSRIs from those who aren't, and controlled for depression severity and things. But overall, our models are pretty able to do a decent job in detecting who's actually taking SSRIs. And this can be used for things like drug discovery of drug side effects. So here we're finding patterns that are associated with disturbances and folks that were predicted for SSRI use, and how our models were making those predictions based on disturbances and early and late evening activities and morning activities. So this is that first camp of research all dealt with trying to predict something that wasn't changing, something that's static. And again, the goal was to try to often try to differentiate clinical populations from those who are non-clinical, trying to detect severity, detect who's receiving treatment. We can do this to try to look into the future and see if we could do something bigger. And there are different categories of research that I think have different, pretty different clinical implications, though I will talk about them separately. The next group of work that we've done are related to trying to predict things longitudinally into the future based on slow changes. And when I say slow changes, they're long-term changes. These are changes that are happening across 2 or more weeks up to several decades. So anything that is essentially within this time frame, and these kinds of changes could really be used in terms of their application. If we could actually predict into the future across these scales, we could think about pairing them with traditional treatments. So trying to enhance traditional treatment or trying to target and develop prevention interventions. So for example, we have done this through, again, wearable movement data where we're trying to predict into the future on how folks would respond, and folks that were in outpatient and inpatient treatment for a major depressive episode, and looking at their changes in depressive symptoms. And we can predict about the majority of the symptom changes that are happening across a 2-week period during this time. We can use internet search data and have used that to try to predict what folks are likely to do in the future after they had seen a digital mental health screen, and trying to see if we can predict into the future whether they're going to search for attributes related to their own mental health characteristics or diagnoses, whether they're going to try to search for treatment and seek treatment in the future, whether they're going to look for methods related to ending their own life or seeking mental health care. And in all of these areas, we could do that to some degree with some degree of accuracy with these kinds of passively collected search data. In terms of other areas that are related to suicidal ideation, suicidal thought and behavior, we have used electronic health record data, so prior visit data to forecast the change that'll happen between visits. We're partnering with an epilepsy clinic at Dartmouth Health here in New Hampshire. And one of the things that they were noticing is that folks were really dying by suicide in their clinics. So we were partnering with them to try to actually implement and see if we can predict who's likely to actually go on and complete. And so here we were predicting suicidal ideation, both active and passive. And we can forecast that in the future using these passive record data, who is more likely to be at risk. We've also looked at completed suicides, and we've got a paper forthcoming in that area, and where we could do it actually fairly well. Our longest area of prediction is this paper, where we're trying to predict out the changes in anxiety symptoms across 17 to 18 years. So this is a hard problem. So trying to predict whether folks are going to deteriorate across 17 to 18 years. And we were using wearable movement data that was captured for 1 week, about nine 9 years in between the two assessments to try to see if we could predict who's likely to change. And when we looked at just the self-report, like a comparison of this, self-reported measures of, say, anxiety symptom severity, we're not able to do this any better than chance. So not able to predict symptom deterioration. Whereas when we use the wearable movement data, we could do things with decent sensitivity, but not so great specificity. But this is way better than chance. So this could really enable a targeted intervention where we really capture most of folks that would be able to actually go on to experience symptom deterioration with a decent level of specificity. So thinking about there's decent degree of sensitivity and just rule out about half of the folks that otherwise wouldn't need it. So it really could potentially think about targeted interventions that would be complementary with traditional means. On the other hand, the things that I think are not compatible, are not easily compatible with the traditional care system are things where we're trying to predict rapid symptom changes. And frankly, the whole diagnostic model as it exists has broadly ignored these things within the area of psychiatry for a long time. So most conceptualizations and how disorders are operationalized and how then they're recapitulated is in assessments and structured clinical interviews. We would ask folks about whether they experienced symptoms most of the day, nearly every day, for usually any time period. It depends on the disorder, but could be between 2 weeks and 6 years. And so essentially the mental health disorders as a whole are often thought to be these chronic conditions that don't change a whole lot when folks would be experiencing some kind of diagnosis or episode. But when you actually get folks who are clinical and you measure them over time, unlike the slow chronic course that folks often kind of are conceptualized to experience, the folks that have the active symptoms, the folks that are in, say, a major depressive episode, their symptoms are far from stable. Most folks have a very large degree of variability, and we can try to predict that variability. So actually, when you measure folks' major depressive symptoms across time, most of the symptom variation that you would see, or at least that we have consistently seen, happens across hours within days, as opposed to across days or weeks. So much more fast-paced changes in these kinds of symptoms. And so we can try to think about predicting these things and then pair them with targeted and just-in-time interventions. And I'll talk about how these things could really do complement digital interventions in a unique way, and talk about that in a bit. So here, each person is a little bit of their own line plot, and you can see each of these lines. There's a blue line and a red line, and our blue line is our predictions, and our red line is our observations of depressed mood across this sample of folks experiencing clinical levels of depression. And you can often see that the red line disappears because the blue line is overlapping with it. And these were really in part because of missing data, but in part it's because these lines are so close to one another that our predictions are actually so overlapping that it can be really hard to distinguish them from the real thing. So overall, we can predict and forecast. This is hour to hour depressed mood just through passive smartphone data that we gathered through a platform that I developed called Mood Triggers, which I'll talk about in a bit. We've used the same platform to predict anxiety and avoidance symptoms among folks with generalized anxiety disorder and social anxiety disorder. And we can predict a lot of the variation in anxiety and avoidance symptoms across time. Again, this is hour to hour changes. You may be wondering, I've been mostly talking about the prediction and how well we're able to predict these different types of states, changes. And this can also be used to think about like targeted methods of interventions. And so when we think about this, where we were looking at, these are personalized deep learning models. So these are models that were developed for each individual at one at a time, idiographic models. And we tried to predict the relationship between their passively collected smartphone sensor data and their anxiety and avoidance symptoms in the future. And you can see that as a whole, these are feature importances essentially on the bottom here, and each different row is a subject. You can see for a lot of folks, the most consistent feature that was predicting anxiety and avoidance symptoms was being indoors, time spent indoors. And so this may mean that we could, for example, think about if this is not only an indicator, but is actually causally related, we could think about actually trying to suggest that folks that are spending some time indoors and are predicted at increased likelihood of actually experiencing a change for the worse in their anxiety and avoidance symptoms, that we in time target and prompt them to actually move outside and spend some time outside. But as you can see, this is the most consistent I've ever seen with idiographic models, and there's a lot of heterogeneity here too. We've done this in other populations outside of anxiety and depression. Here we're trying to predict affect and folks with and adolescents with anorexia nervosa and non-disordered controls, and we can do that pretty well. We've also done this within outside clinical settings, so trying to do this within work settings, and we can predict things like rumination and sleep quality fairly well across persons. We can do this within individuals, so a lot of the methods that I was talking about today within the short-term changes is predicting individual changes with individualized, personalized models. Stepping out, there's a lot of different ways to use these data. Another thing that we've done is to try to use some of these types of data, so this is internet search behavior, to try to study changes associated with rapid changes that are associated with the announcement of stay-at-home orders in the States, and looking at how these stay-at-home orders may have actually changed the trajectory of mental health symptom searches, which are a good proxy actually for observations of mental health symptoms. And we, for example, saw that the announcement of stay-at-home orders across different states was associated with this immediate blunting of different mental health symptom searches that was unique to the mental health symptom array. So in terms of this category of this passively collected data, we can capture passive data through smartphones and wearables and the internet, and then we can actually predict the severity and both rapid and long-term changes in symptoms. All right, so that's great. I've talked a lot about assessment so far. So all of these predictions I would put in the camp of assessment, but how can we maybe pair and think about using this within treatments? Well, we've done a lot of work trying to develop different digital interventions for different areas. So I've done this with, for example, a generalized anxiety disorder, and partnered with Lantern, and developing these different areas and targeting across multiple sites in the United States and India. And generally, they worked decently well as a whole when you look at them at groups compared to controlled conditions. But as we saw, or as I talked about at the very beginning of this presentation, in traditional treatments, not everyone benefits. And that's the same is true for digital intervention work. Not everyone benefits from these digital interventions. And I think we need more work trying to determine which interventions are likely to benefit whom. And so we can actually forecast and predict who's likely to benefit from different digital interventions. So this could enable personalized recommendations for digital intervention work. We can also use ongoing assessments that are happening during the course of a digital intervention, seeing how folks are actually engaging with different digital work, and have done that and been able to try to predict the symptom change that folks are likely to experience. So this can forecast essentially a triage system where we could enable and target folks that are, for example, here We were finding, for example, if it wasn't just levels of engagement that mattered, it was the consistency of engagement patterns. And that was the consistency mattered more than what the average levels would be. And so there we could use this and actually stop folks that may be less likely to benefit and say, hey, you may recommend that you engage in a different way, or actually take them off because we don't think they're likely to benefit. We've also used these types of passively collected sensor data, and we've used them to drive personalized interventions. So here, I'm going to talk about an application I developed called Mood Triggers. This is the very old interface that I developed myself, not being an expert in UI or UX, as you can probably tell. Now I've worked with designers, and it looks a lot better. But this is what it looked like when I was steering the ship on the design phase. I delivered this and had folks install it from across the globe in over 100 countries. How Mood Triggers works was they would ask folks about their anxiety and depressive symptoms, and then it would ask about a number of different symptoms that they were experiencing that are thought to be theoretically causal processes that could maintain changes and different anxiety and depressive symptoms. We also did passive sensing through their smartphone sensor data, and then the main thing that we were providing in terms of an intervention was actually trying to give them personalized feedback based on these idiographic statistical models to try to help them understand what is actually predicting the changes, the hour-to-hour changes in their anxiety and depressive symptoms. This is the anxiety and depressive symptoms across 1 week. You can see pretty large changes in their anxiety and depressive symptoms. And I am fairly skeptical, actually, that we would have this big of an effect. But this has been an uncontrolled open trial. We've got an RCT that's kind of wrapping up right about now. So we'll know how this performs compared to a control group. But these effect sizes are actually quite large and mirror some of what you would see after several sessions within psychotherapy research. So I'm a little skeptical that these numbers are going to be as good as we're seeing in this very large open trial, but overall it looked pretty good to start with. We've seen in digital interventions, and as you talk to folks that do this type of work, you often see this kind of engagement pattern where a lot of folks will download the app, but then very few have long-term sustained use of a digital therapeutic. And I think in part this is based on how a lot of the field has evolved, where a lot of the generally was not necessarily, engagement wasn't at the forefront of what folks have been doing. And I was taking, say, something that used to be a manualized session by session material and putting that online, and it's kind of overwhelming for a lot of folks. And so one way to break that down and try to improve the engagement patterns is by making it interactive through, say, conversational agents or chatbot. And most of the field has been working with something that I called an authored chatbot, or a chatbot that is essentially taking that same website material and then breaking it down by if-then statements and presenting it to the user at a time. And you folks, I imagine every single person on this call has interacted with a conversational agent, which could be like a vocal version of the same thing when you talk to customer service, when you call in, when you have some trouble with your airlines. And you can probably find, or your cable or things like that, because they're very popular in customer service areas because they're pretty cheap to develop, frankly, and they kind of get some, they kind of work, but they're really frustrating, I think, for the user, because when you would want to talk to someone, they often really don't feel like conversations. They're one-sided, and essentially how they're developed is somebody has to anticipate every aspect of the conversation and how it'll flow, and the people who are designing the chatbot determine all of that ahead of time. And the big fundamental problem related to this is they're not actually conversational. Although it's supposed to be delivered in this chat-based interface, they don't really feel like a conversation. And we've done work in these areas and found, done work within prevention of eating disorders and looked at it in across different populations and found that they do these types of interventions, although they're not very sophisticated, they do really work. And actually here we're looking at prevention of eating disorder onset among folks who are at risk. And so, you know, that they're not great, but they do work. But I think we have a lot of room to actually do much better. And I think this talk, fortunately, if you all have seen the release of Open or Chat GPT, which is a chat-based interface for GPT-3, you'll get a sense of what we've been working on for several years, which is based on these large language models. So these language models can generate text that sounds like a human, and they're based on a lot of the advances that have been happening through natural language processing and deep learning. And they feed in an exorbitantly large amount of data such that these models can essentially learn how to speak and emulate human speech. So one of the goals that we've been developing for, I don't know, we're going into our 4th year now with these generative approaches, is developing a generative chatbot that could actually be used in a therapeutic sense. So again, they work by example rather than like the author chatbots where we tell and we design what the chatbot will say. These models will kind of actually generate their own text of trying to emulate what we have done, but they're saying things that we never told it to say, trying to build on the principles of what we're teaching it. So a lot of it is essentially much like I think a therapist might learn first and trying to actually see how they would emulate therapy. They actually look and see what other folks are doing and how therapy actually looks like in settings. And so my first thought that was frankly very naive was I figured that the biggest thing that we needed when I was getting into this was just gobs and gobs of data. So where are there readily available gobs and gobs and gobs of data related to mental health and interactions related to mental health that are often trying to support one another, mental health forum data. So folks that would be peer support, provide peer support to one another. So we captured a heck of a lot of it and fed it into these generative models. And it really didn't go well. The models learned to actually speak like one forum member interacting with another, but they really weren't what we were going for. So here, for example, I'll show the same script across different iterations of this chatbot work. And when we would put in something like, I'm feeling depressed, sometimes I feel like I don't want to get out of bed, the response that our therapeutic chatbot was supposed to say was, life is such a struggle. Most days I don't know how I have the energy to go on. I end up wanting to cry alone in a corner. I just want my life to be over. Learn to talk like someone who was maybe also going through some of the same things, but this isn't exactly what we were going for. So I dialed it in a completely different directions and obtained thousands of psychotherapy transcripts. And so there's a lot of this available. People have recorded these types of sessions. And I thought, well, let's go to the experts. Let's go where and try to emulate that. And one of the things that we learned was that our chatbots were really, really good at picking up on the bad habits of psychotherapists because they're so pervasive and they're so repetitive. And this may be fine in some settings that are in person, but they don't translate well to digital interventions where, so same prompt, I'm feeling depressed, sometimes I feel like I don't want to get out of bed. The response would be, what do you think I should do? Go on. I don't know what to say. I want some help. And then we got a lot of mischaracterizations about things like stemming from the relationship with their mother. And so this really didn't go well. There was a lot of failure points that we were seeing, but we're clearly seeing that the models themselves were able to emulate the speech. We just weren't feeding the right speech in. So what we've done is we've designed and built this in-house. We have thousands and thousands worth of, if we were to print it out, of the text that we've actually generated, it would be thousands and thousands of pages worth of text conversations that we've been generating that are based on empirically supported treatment principles that are breaking it down to actually curate and let the model learn how to train from this, because it's designed in ways that are emulating empirically supported treatments. And our models have gotten dramatically better as we've done this. I won't even tell you and show you what the self-help forum data was because it was so bad. But we went from about 1 in 10 responses when we would evaluate the responses being clinically appropriate and personalized to the response query, to about 9 in 10 of the responses that we're putting in being appropriate. And we're launching a randomized controlled trials in this right away. Actually, it's kind of like putting the fine features. We call this Therabot. You can see our interface, and we've got UI UX folks that have designed an avatar that moves, and you can see, let's see, sorry. You can see our intervention here, and essentially how this icon actually is mimicking some of what could be some expressions that look a little bit human-like without being a human. So overall, I think there's a lot of promise in these different areas, and that can enable personalization within digital intervention work, and we can help to personalize the types of interventions that folks are receiving, and address the heterogeneity across persons through both these passive and active digital intervention content. So a lot of this, I think, can drive selection of treatment, enable personalized feedback, and then dynamically deliver responses that feel dynamic to the person. We had a book that was released in September of 2022 that covers a lot of these different areas. I invite you to take a look if you want a little bit more background or a little bit more thorough thought in these areas. And I also just want to thank my lab for all of their hard work in this area. They have made all of this this work possible, and I certainly could not have taken on these areas without them. So that's about it. I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you. What a whirlwind. That was amazing. And many, many questions in the Q&A. So we'll dive in, but people did a great job of putting them in throughout. The first question is, you talked a bit about the privacy issues of what gets collected, and someone had asked that they get really worried when clinicians get excited about the data capture potential from smartphones. Generally, that there's limited comprehension from users of how the internet tracks people, the operating system, the app stores, and how do you go about making sure your data capture from vulnerable people is kept confidential. There is a related question, so I'll just partner with it, which is, are you concerned about releasing HIPAA-protected information and invasion of privacy if social media or cell phone companies use predictive modeling to diagnose users for advertising purposes? So 2 different things, but sort of linked. I thought I would ask them together.
Yeah. I think a lot of this ultimately, how I think that a lot of these channels and the importance of this is trying to capture these data within settings that folks can ultimately trust in informed ways. So ultimately, I think a lot of this really gets around issues related to informed consent and making sure that folks know what types of data are being collected, and they can understand that, and they know how these data are going to be used. I will say that we wrote a paper on actually some of the ethics related to these areas, and it's really complicated when we think about the applications of these types of data, because participants are naive, people that are not researchers in these areas, folks that are maybe using these kinds of sensors, do not necessarily understand how we could potentially use these types of passively collected data, even if we don't actively capture some kind of active response. So I'll give you some examples of the precision in which some folks have tried to apply these kinds of channels to predictive models. So just using wearable movement data, folks have tried to predict whether someone was specifically using the action of stoking a fire, and they were able to do that decently well. This sounds kind of ridiculously specific. And if you zoom out and think about all of the types of behaviors that might be captured through movement data, this could be capture moments of intimacy, especially when you pair it with heart rate. Folks often don't think through or appreciate this, and it's really hard to convey the complexity of the channels that you'd be gathering. The best that we try to do is really try to tell people about it, and then we quiz them on it, and we give them opportunity to try to answer questions and engage with us. But frankly, I think it's really hard to have fully informed consent, because the space of what you can do with the data actually evolves as the science evolves, and we can't always predict where the science is going to go. So we do our best in that way, but frankly, it's a really difficult area to try to have something where a researcher would have the capability of doing something that they didn't even think about from the outset when they're collecting the data. So this kind of rapidly evolving landscape of things that are complex in nature makes it's fairly difficult. So when we think about then applications of this, I tend not to be as concerned about these areas within research settings because of the amount of oversight that both researchers have internally, and then through IRBs and things where there's a lot of oversight within these kinds of settings. In industry settings, it's the Wild West, and you can capture a lot of these data and they can go in various places. And I have concerns about that with my own data. I have concerns about that with patients, and it's pretty easy to legally get your bases covered through terms of service agreements that folks may not read but be able to accept. So I share the same concerns that folks do in the commercial settings. Ultimately, I think it comes down to the right commercial partners, and hopefully that in terms of how to find those. There are whole entities, for example, One Mind Cyber Guide and the American Psychiatric Association has an app evaluation framework that they've developed that both try to evaluate apps and try to look at things like the privacy statements and levels of trust and efficacy around different things. So I think that these kinds of efforts are helpful for clinician-focused work, as well as the FDA for other regulation, though I have some skepticism about that regulatory pathway with this work. But anyway, I won't get too far into it, but I think there's a lot of reason to be skeptical about how these data are used and collected. And mostly in terms of the ethics of it, I think it involves really trying to inform users the best you can, and then developing trust on how the data are being used and where it's going.
Thank you. Another question is, in terms of predicting outcomes with passively collected data, have you found, for example, demographic group differences worth noting, such as race, ethnicity, and other minoritized statuses?
Yeah, it varies a lot based on what we would be capturing. And there are some problems actually within different sensors. So we talked about heart rate sensors, for example. There's the contradictory literature that has evolved and been published in different outlets where you'll see that, particularly around dark skins, some of the light that is transmitted to try to be bounced back and reflected off of the skin to gather PPG data is there's about half of the studies that I've seen published have shown that there is worse performance of heart rate data capture and folks with darker skin. And so I think this is a problem. And frankly, I think a lot of it is a lot of the types of data that we're capturing aren't well calibrated across diverse populations. And I think we should be skeptical as we go through on trying to make sure that we are calibrating these models across people who are often in populations that may be underappreciated. I think that gets compounded in these large language models that I was talking about at the end, where we can generate text, for example. Like, it's really sometimes hard to, we can see what may be happening and observe biases and sensors that maybe happen at the sensor level. But as we start to combine information gets harder to see where the gaps are. So I think really auditing our systems for evidence of bias experimentally and causally is something that we've been doing, and found some biases that often perpetuate the same kinds of things that humans find, but this also allows us opportunities to correct for those biases. So I think we've got a long way to go, and the field is very young, and this is a big area I think that we need to increasingly concentrate on.
Thank you. I have a question from Adam Goodkind saying, I study keystroke dynamics and conversational chat. Have you looked at exploring production data such as keystroke patterns beyond just lexical data like word choice?
Yeah, I guess we haven't captured keystroke data ourselves for on mobile. In large part, within passive sensing, we could be doing a lot of things that are more invasive, and ultimately kind of something that I call the creep factor can go up a lot depending on what types of sensors that you would be gathering. So I'll give you an example of something where we draw the line. And for example, we could have interventions that or some types of assessment data where we are continuously turning on folks' video cameras, and there's technology that we could use to actually do that, right? So turn on the cameras and have and keep the videos that would be happening passively, but we don't do that. And a big reason why we don't do that is because we want to make sure that folks are willing to do this, and we're not capturing data that are inherently so private that we wouldn't want the data to start with. And I think folks have come up with other methods to help with this, and I think it's not as big of a deal. Like other research teams have done this very successfully with participants and found not as much flack as I was originally anticipating in these areas. But frankly, that was part of why I avoided the use of capture through keyboard capture. Really I just didn't want to capture that data because of actually how many things could be captured that way. There's a lot of privacy preserving means to capture these type of data, and I think a lot of teams have found that these kinds of data can be captured pretty successfully with research participants, but that we've kind of drawn the line and not use that within mobile keyboard capture settings. But I know folks at Northwestern and elsewhere that are doing phenomenal work in that area. So kind of based on assumptions that I had about 10 years ago about what was also acceptable and kind of carried forward to some degree. But I don't know, my opinions have changed to some degree on the keyboard capture. So, but that's some of why we haven't gotten into it.
So we have about 2 minutes left. There's an interesting, albeit long response. So I'm going to hopefully summarize it. And then if you need more context, let me know. But it was about your study on SSRI use in actigraphy, and that it was cross-sectional, use the PHQ, which can be a bit of a poor measure of symptoms. And the bigger question is really, is it possible to describe an accelerometer finding as a quote side effect of SSRIs using a rough measure of depression in a cross-sectional paradigm? And then the question closed by saying, more broadly speaking, what standards should we take in the field to hold studies to that purport to identify side effects? Yeah.
All right. So I will say, like every study that I talked about has its own limitations, both in its measures and the way that we have data capture. It's often going to be incomplete. When I think about this, I think of these kinds of things and look at the body of evidence of these literatures. So like not looking at a single study, but thinking about like how we can draw conclusions across studies. The side effects of like trying to uncover possible side effects through use of medications, I think, and that study in particular, we were actually using data that were partially corroborated among folks that were actually looking to see through folks' home whether they were actually like had an antidepressant or SSRI script that was in their home. And so some of this was somewhat validated. the measure, like our potential confounds for things like depression severity as indexed by the PHQ with an incomplete measure, it's got its own problems. It certainly doesn't capture the breadth and the range of severity associated with depression perfectly. But I think as a starting point, we were finding that when we would control for it, we really don't. Our predictions were not limited to just capture of depression severity as indexed by the PHQ, which gives us some potential that these really are capturing some side effects, given that there is this large literature that has been theorized about disturbances in motor movement. I think we probably are capturing differences in motor behavior that may be a side effect of SSRIs, but certainly it's incomplete and more research is needed before we can make definitive conclusions. But I do think that it could point in that direction. And sorry, what was the broader question, Andrea? I lost sight of
It's about what the standards for our field, but I'm also realizing it's the top of the hour and folks may have to go, including you. So we appreciate this.
Yeah, and I just want to add my thanks, Nick. This was a tremendous talk. It really is a remarkably broad program of research that you have here. So thank you. So the folks out there who are still on, this video will be posted on our website in the next day or two. The next talk will not be on the first Tuesday, but it'll be on the second Tuesday of January, because the first Tuesday is right after the holidays, and we figured most people wouldn't want to be here. And so Megan Jones-Bell will be talking about Google's work in mental health. So I'm going to wish everybody that their sensor data will reflect joy and happiness over the holidays, and we will see you all in the new year. Again, thanks a lot, Nick.
Thank you, Nick.
Thanks, folks.